So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is after a long gap that we are again having an event of this nature in this Eastern Quadrangle. So it is a first after a long time, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome all of you back to this venue of the Victoria Memorial Hall, which has been witness to so many wonderful events in the past few years. And this evening, we are going to start this series, hopefully, which will go on without any interruptions of any pandemic or whatever, or lockdowns. So this evening, we are going to have an illustrated talk on museums during and post-COVID. And the speaker is none other than Vinod Daniel, known to many of you present here, because a lot of you have come precisely to listen to him. He is the chairman of Aus Heritage and board member of the International Council of Museums. But before we hand over the floor to him, may I request Dr. Joyinto Sengupta, curator and secretary of Victoria Memorial Hall, to come and welcome the audience.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Eastern Quadrangle and to this evening's lecture on museums during and post-COVID. We are all trying to get ourselves attuned to a new normal, and it's nice that we are back here. We are, as you can well imagine, we are all trying to recover from the tsunami of a prime ministerial visit. And for us, this lecture is one of our efforts to get back to a sort of old normal, as it were, because this is the place where in the winter we assemble for good conversations. We did one event here on site before in the aftermath of Soumitra Chatterjee's passing to celebrate one of his books. But after a long time, we are back here to listen to Vinod, my good friend Vinod Daniel, to speak on something which we in the museums community and those of you who visit museums on a regular basis are looking forward to having some guidance, some advisory on. Like all over the world, we in the museums and also the various cultural institutions are groping for answers. We do not know the right answers to a world ravaged by COVID-19. And this is, but a set of answers is something that we have to thrash out together. And that is one of the reasons why we are having this conversation today. And I'm glad to see many of you of the museum community and the cultural field sector to come and listen to Mr. Vinod Daniel and also to participate in these conversations. So, Vinod Daniel, of course, needs no introduction to this audience. He is one of our foremost experts on the making of museums, but still I have to say a little bit about him. So I will just briefly talk a little bit about him and then we will look forward to his talk and the conversations that follow. It's a privilege and an honor, as always, to have with us here this evening my good friend Vinod Daniel, to provide us with some guidance on how to keep the museum scenario not only alive and kicking, but vibrant in the world ravaged by COVID-19. And it's truly wonderful that we have Vinod to speak on this issue, because he is an internationally recognized museum specialist with over 3 decades of experience working on all aspects of museums, including development, planning, collections, conservation, exhibition, risk management, education, and repatriation of cultural assets. He worked as a senior manager with the Australian Museum in Sydney and the J. Paul Getty Trust in Los Angeles, as well as on museum-related projects in over 50 countries and several international professional networks. He has delivered over 100 workshops on museum-related aspects published over 70 technical papers, and has been quoted extensively by the global media. He is the chairman of the board for Aus Heritage, and he is also the chief executive officer of Daniel Aspect PT Limited, and a board member of the International Council of Museums, or ICOM. Apart from being one of the world's foremost experts on the making of museums and the conservation of collections, Vinod wears several other hats, and those include serving as the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Trustee of the India Vision Institute, an independent, not-for-profit registered trust that works all over India to help people with visual challenges and prevent avoidable blindness. And we were fortunate to collaborate with the India Vision Institute for an event in the Victoria Memorial Hall and its outside periphery. So in a somewhat similar fashion to what he does for the India Vision Institute, we look up to him today to provide all of us that are groping around in the dark in a world tarnished by COVID with some advisories and insights on how museums and cultural institutions deal with the challenges of the new normal. And that's all I have to say for now. And like all of you, I'm looking forward to this talk and the subsequent conversations on one of the most intriguing challenges facing us in these times. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Vinod Daniel to speak on museums during and post-COVID. Thank you. Thank you.
So before Mr. Vinod Daniel takes the microphone, may I request Dr. Joyanta Sengupta to kindly hand over a small token of our appreciation on behalf of Victoria Memorial Hall to Mr. Vinod Daniel. Yes, I think that's better. It's a better photo op if you have it on stage. And of course, as usual, I have to request all of you to kindly put your mobile phones on silent or switch them off completely. I hope the day is not far off when I can maybe say from here, Alexa, please switch off all the phones or put them on silent mode. So it's over to Mr. Vinod Daniel for the next 45 minutes or so, after which I'm sure he will be only too willing to take questions from the audience. So there will be a Q&A session. Feel free to ask your questions. The microphone, the floor is all yours.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think just the setting is fantastic. It's marvelous. I never expected I would ever do a lecture in a setting like this. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And Jayanta has been a great friend. This institution has been a great partner for several decades, so it's so nice to be back here. It's also great to have a whole bunch of others who I've known for ages to be here, Sayan, GM, Mervyn, a number of others. I'm also delighted that Jayanta has said that this is a conversation, because that's how I would like to shape it. What I would like to do is maybe speak for about 20-25 minutes with some thoughts, and then after that we can just open it up for questions, if that's okay. Again, fantastic setting, so delighted to be here. So what I plan on doing is, I've kind of worked within the museum realm in so many different countries. I keep in touch with that sector regularly, not just within India, but across the world. I've hosted a whole bunch of webinars over this whole period. I'm also on the board of ICOM, where this is the biggest topic that's being discussed, now, in terms of how is the world coping with COVID. Also, ICOM recently did its second survey on how museums are dealing with COVID. I just want to present some of the data that came out from that, as a background, and I'll also add a bit of my observations at the end. So I hope that all these things would be enough to start a conversation here. So the first part of my talk is going to be focused on the survey and some of the findings. This survey was done by the International Council of Museums based in Paris. It's the global peak body for museums. It's got more than 45,000 members from about 160 plus countries. So it's quite comprehensive. The survey analyzed the responses from about 1,000 plus professionals during October, November. As to be expected, based on the membership, which is nearly half European, or even more than half European, the responses were about 50% from Europe, and the rest were from other parts of the world, including about 11% from this part of the world, Asia. And among the people who responded, about 80% were people who work directly with museums as museum staff. The rest were people who work as consultants and contractors with museums. So that's the context of the survey. Now, over to the results. So, towards November, overall, about 80% of the museums were open again. Compared to the previous survey that was done around March, April, May, where it was all doom and gloom. So it was great that this much percentage of museums were open. But within these museums, about 82% of the people were back at work. Either they work right on campus or they work from home, or a mix of both. They sometimes come once or twice a week to work. But unfortunately, about 15% also lost their jobs, during this whole period. So that's the kind of nature. 6% of museums will close permanently. So this is again in a broad global context. Now this is so much more promising because in the first survey, which was done around April, May, there was an expectation about 15% of the museums may not be able to open its doors again. Now 50% of the museums are considering reducing their working hours for a variety of reasons, including balancing budgets and a whole range of other things. Among the people who responded, 70% of the institutions, their major funding source was the government. Very similar probably to Victoria Memorial and the Indian Museum and museums in that context. The biggest impact was on museums that were non-government funded. Basically, museums where visitation was high, they expect to earn a lot of the revenue from visitors, which is again to be expected because people couldn't go to museums, or people could go to museums only in small numbers. And the earned revenue loss was approximately about 30% of the budget. Am I going fast or am I okay? Yeah. Now, in terms of what would the impact of something like this be, the results were that probably close to 70% were thinking that programs are going to be severely restricted. So that would be a direct outcome. This, within programs, it would include exhibitions. So there's going to be a big impact on the number of exhibitions these museums would be doing. About 1/3 expect to downsize staff. External contracts would be severely compromised because that was also a big money-saving exercise there. And 33, again 1/3 expect that they'll get less money from the government, and 40% felt that the money that is going to come from external funding bodies, could be companies, could be a whole range of other sources, would decrease by 40%. As to be expected, I'm sure there's been a lot of media articles in this realm. The digital activities have increased. But one broad comment I make is, I don't think there's been substantial new developments as much, except their social media presence went up quite dramatically by about 40%. Whether it's Facebook or Twitter or any of those things, museums started putting much more of things through that so that it can go to the public. There were some live events, so on an average, the increase in live events was about 22%. Some more collections were put online, about 20% more. And the interesting part is the ones that didn't do too well in this area were the public funded museums who had less personnel and programs in this area because they were not that adept at transforming into the digital arena compared to the ones that were privately funded or were independent in their own realm. The other findings were, fortunately, 80% of the museums said that security and collection care all through this phase were not compromised. But that still means that some institutions felt it was compromised, and that they were mostly from the Arab Asia Pacific region and Africa, the developing part of the world. When museums reopened, in terms of the new norm that they put in place, 96% made sure that sanitizers were used, quite regularly, and 90% also regulated flows. Basically, they decreased the number of visitors who would come to a museum. So these were some of the findings. My final bit of results. So in terms of the biggest threats that museums, feel through this whole phase is, about 59% are pretty worried about the museum's future. Some not opening again, or some might be opening in partial ways. 12% were worried about the collections. Before I said 80% were positive that security was good. Among the rest 20, at least 12% felt the collections were under threat. 33% were very worried about the salaries and the future. And about 44% were very, very worried about staff and visitors. So this is what came out of the survey. So now I'll just move on to my observations. I've been talking to so many people around the world, hosting so many different webinars, and I'm just going to put some of those things together as my observations, just to kind of trigger a conversation after that. I think it goes without saying that government funding is going to be limited because most countries, have a shrinking in their GDP. So I would imagine there's going to be cuts happening in different aspects, and definitely a sector like museums, which often would be considered as a low priority sector, the cuts would be there. Now, if you take a country like China, which was going through a museum boom, 200 to 400 new museums opening every year, I think the impact would be much higher compared to some of the other countries where, it might be where there's enough money to make sure the staff are being paid, but you'd probably have a bit of pressure on additional money to do other things. And that brings the whole issue on how you could probably make sure you go and look for revenue elsewhere. I think that's going to become a very important component. If you look at museums that are non-government funded, when I say non-government funded, you look at most of the big museums, they still report to the government, but they have a totally independent trust, and the government gives a grant every year. The grant could be anything between 30 and 60% or 70%. But I'm putting them also in this category. Now, in their case, they have to raise the rest of the money from elsewhere. When visitor numbers went down, they really struggle to balance the budget. To give you an example, you look at the Metropolitan Museum, they are losing about $100 million a year. That's a very significant cut. You're talking about hundreds of staff being laid out, nothing significant in terms of programs that are going to happen. So their annual budget typically would be about 400 million or whatever. So they're losing about 25% of the budget. So there is a big need that museums have to really rethink in terms of looking for funding outside this, including the current museums that report to the government, whether it's central or state. The other thing also is, I think the sector as such would benefit quite well if they can put a good case to the government about any governmental support that's possible. I understand the last stimulus that came in the US, 15 billion was put towards the creative arts sector, including museums. It was not just museums, including performing arts and that whole sector, but that's a substantial amount of money. So I would imagine it's quite important that the museums, that currently work with the government need to put that case quite strongly. But it's very encouraging to know that the Prime Minister was here and a whole range of senior people have been here. So all that speaks well for how they would, look at something like that. The next thing is online. I think online is going to be the way to go. Now, what does online do? Online is going to find new audiences. So people who may not come here to the museum because, they normally don't go to the museums, or they might be living in a different state or a different country, these are new audiences. Now, if you can actually capitalize on that, you might be able to increase your visitation many times. To give you an example, you take the Australian Museum, for example, they might get 500,000 through the gate, but they might get 20 million through the web. So the number of visitors who come to visit the museums, you can increase it substantially. And one of the things that this pandemic has done is made everyone a bit more aware and friendly on the whole online mechanism. I think people feel comfortable, whether it's Zoom or whatever it is. I think people feel that here is an avenue that you can use. But it's quite important that the same standard ones we do, it's going to get boring. You've got to get more creative. And one of the plus points for India is the IT sector here is fantastic. The movie industry is fantastic. How do you really use them so that you can get more creative contents up there and make it more exciting? I think that would be good. The other good thing that also would happen is typically the target audience that usually don't come to museums is the middle age group between 15 and 35. People come when they are kids, then they come after they have kids. So usually you lose that. But this is the group that would probably use online and technical things very adeptly, and you might be able to capitalize on that. But the key here is you had a budget this much. I'm sure the pandemic, maybe 2021, maybe for the next 3 years, you're going to lose a bit of the budget. You've got to find the money somewhere. Monetizing this online, it's still something that I can't give examples on institutions that have succeeded. So we got to be very creative in doing that, getting creative contents, but also translating that into money. Because without that, how would you balance it? When a visitor walks in through the door, you collect a ticket, get them to go eat in your cafeteria, get them to buy some merchandise, a whole range of things, and you know how to raise money. So you got to be very creative how you really do this in an online one. And I think that would be quite important. And I'm sure if India does this well, you'll again be a global leader within the museum movement. It's very similar to how when landlines were there on telephones and then we had mobile technology. I mean, India kind of, jumped over everybody else in the world. In terms of reach, in terms of cost, in terms of a whole range of things. So here's an opportunity. The other thing also is many people keep saying, oh, look, if I put it online, no one will come to the museum. But all the data, all the research shows that if you have something virtual, they will come to see the real more likely. You're not going to see a Mona Lisa on the web and not go and see the real Mona Lisa. You're not going to see a Ravi Verma on the web and not go see the real Ravi Verma. So in many ways, it's not one or the other. I think online would be building on what you have real. So I don't think museums should be scared about losing audiences because of the online presence. And the very last point I want to make here is current staff need a lot of hand-holding because this is not something that they have grown, getting used to, staff who work in museums. So there needs to be a lot of skill building, and you've got to be strategic in building new teams so that you have this in mind. I mean, you're still going to have all your regular physical aspects doing. But in addition, you're going to do this online. How do you, skill up the current staff, but also have additional staff? I think that's quite important. Then other observation I'll make is in human resources. One thing you hear all the time is, look, we don't have enough skilled people in this sector. But one of the things this pandemic has basically taught us is that you can still work remotely. I think maybe a year back, the whole idea of work from home or not being here was taboo. Look, somebody is probably goofing off and not really being productive. But right now, it's part of the norm. Now, what this would now do is there's a whole bunch of skilled people around the world who can contribute the kind of skills that museums need. You can capitalize. I mean, these could be women, women at certain times where, look, I mean, they're tied up at home because of young children, whatever it is. Could be highly skilled people who might be in a different city. So I think museums can capitalize it. They can be highly skilled people in a different country. And I think in some ways the Indian museum sector can benefit if you can capitalize on this. So don't look at HR just being somebody you can hire who can come here. This can be from any part of the world. How do you bring certain skill sets so that you can achieve certain objectives? Public programs, I think one of the common things I keep hearing around is there's not going to be much money for exhibitions. Blockbuster exhibitions were big things, especially in the West. I mean, sometimes a big exhibition might cost them $6 million. Now, that money is not going to be there. So what everyone's going to do is, how are you going to capitalize on your own collections and put more exhibitions? Before, they were looking at audiences from around the world. Now, how do I understand the audience around my museum better so that I can actually get them? So these are some of the thoughts that are going to happen in public programs that I think one needs to be aware of. The next one I also see as a trend that's happening is, look, there's a little bit of downtime. There's not too much money for doing blockbuster exhibitions, a whole range of other things. Let's get the house in order. Let's make sure our collections, our database, they're clean, basic aspects are done so that, these were things that were not possible. It's like when the Prime Minister's visit happens, you can't do anything else. All your energy is spent on making sure that event happens. Same way when exhibitions happen, when there's a whole bunch of, big things happen, it's very hard. Maybe for the next 3-4 years, let's get the house in order. Let's get all our collections, database, photographed, because then later on, when the thing comes up, you have all the tools that you need to take it to a different level. I just want to touch on one aspect, and this is a big worry for me. I call it distributed national collections. I just put Sachin's picture because I know that will capture more attention. One thing to keep in mind is 99% of collections in any country are outside museums. So when we all talk about collections, we always think of collections within museums. But temples, private hands, a whole range of aspects, whole range of areas is where many of the collections are. I know there's been a whole issue on collections taken illegally out, collections, being returned back because of certain whatever. But I think that particular aspect needs to be really rethought in terms of at least doing some basic documentation or, because I really feel that area is going to get threatened when the funding goes down. There's not going to be enough resources to really police that area as much. So I'm just going to finish my small presentation and then open it up. So some key takeaway messages. Understand and connect with the community audience around your museum more, which wasn't a high priority before, but it's going to be a higher priority now. I know people like the Met are doing more exhibitions that are more New York-centric rather than having big international blockbusters. The second one is, I think this sector, unfortunately, is not a high-profile sector. Often, when I go to the Chennai Museum, they would say this person is there because it's a punishment posting, let's put him there. That kind of a thing. let's see how we can make this into a high-profile sector, because that also would then reflect more on government support and funding. I think it's quite important. And it's really great that the Prime Minister and significant people come here, because now they understand the importance more, and I think they're all things in the right direction. The third one is work a good structure. I know that institutions like this and many other cultural institutions do have a trust, and they also have professionals who run it. But if it's too government controlled, then it's harder to raise money, especially if you reach a time where it's not that easy for institutions to get enough money from the government. You got to go outside, and it's easier based on my experience looking at museums outside, where there's a bit of flexibility. Just like before I said, it's not, the public institutions have not done too well in the online thing, because it's not that easy for them to change. So that change happens when there's a little more freedom and flexibility. Money that comes in is used within this museum, doesn't go into the main coffer and then comes back, all those kind of things. So this might be a good time to kickstart those discussions, because there's an opportunity saying, look, the money is coming down, we got to find money somewhere. So can we also work on these kind of structural arrangements? The last one is also leadership. It's great having somebody like Jayanta here, long-term, stable. That's the only way you can build an institution. Often what I say is, if you want to increase funding and you want to build something up, you got to have a director who's there for 8 to 10 years. It's not easy to get something done in 2 years or 3 years. You really need that time, to really build things up. My very last slide is, I think one of the biggest treasures we have in India is our intangible heritage. If the museums could combine what we have with regard to our collections with some of the intangible aspects, including stories and dances and performances and all that, I think we can probably drive more local audience to come into a museum, and also probably frame our own museology concepts. I've seen all through the Pacific, they even have moved away from calling their museums as museums to calling them as cultural centers, because they just want the local population to come and have the buy-in. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk, and I'll just open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vinod, for those extremely insightful thinking points. We have to think through all of this. And I thought there were several critically important takeaways from what you spoke, some of which are pretty straightforward and obvious, but they escape our attention. They tend to escape our attention sort of normally. Like you told us that because this is a sort of a downtime, our energies are not focused on doing something blockbuster, doing something ambitious, doing something frenetic. Therefore, it is a time that could be usefully spent in getting the basics in order, like digitization. We know that all of the museum professionals out here, we have this big government-funded digitization project where we are using a collection management software called Jatan to put the images and data, basic data relating to all of our objects online, and they all get transported to this website called the Museums of India, which is an extraordinary thing because it's the only website to the best of my knowledge where you can see the combined, integrated, keyword searchable collection of all the major government museums in India. Now, we have been struggling with deadlines to finish that project, but perhaps this is the time to do it. This is the time to focus our energies on that. This is the time to focus our energies on conservation and other basic things. So that's an extremely important takeaway. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure there will be questions for you. You know, we are all looking for ideas. We are all looking forward to presenting some of our ideas. And so the floor is open. If you have questions regarding what Vinod said in terms of the roadmap ahead, please feel free to ask a question, and then we will have a conversation. Because to having a conversation on these important issues is the idea of this evening's event. So the floor is open. Please identify yourself and ask the question. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel, for an erudite lecture. I would like to ask you a question is regarding that online portal development for the museums, like where we're looking for developing virtual museums. How much do you think is going to be successful from an Indian perspective? I'll give you an example. Say this is the time of the year when there is this Gangasagar festival and there are people coming, influxing into the cities from not just Bengal and Calcutta, from a large, vast section of the North Indian states. And they are a revenue producer for the museum because if all the zoos and museums are open, they like and go and visit. And a vast number of them, in spite of India being a high-tech country and having a huge infrastructure in computer, there is a lot of computer illiteracy too. Like in the remote rural areas, internet and online visits are not possible. So if this is closed down and we look only for virtual museums in the long run from a populous country like India, where there is, lack of education and lack of internet facilities in a vast section who are revenue generators, how is this going to help the museums in generating revenues in the long run?
Thank you. Yeah. Look, my view is, if you ask in 5 years' time, we're going to forget about the pandemic by then, right? What's going to happen is museums are going to open. They're going to have a whole range of. Can you hear me? Yeah. There's going to be a whole range of public programs and all that kind of stuff. But what this is going to do is, it's going to add one more element which was not there before. That element, if you can do it well, you will reach more audiences. Whatever said and done, a physical visit to a museum, only a few people can come. People who can afford to travel to a city, people who live close by. So anyway, there are restrictions. I think each time you peel an outer layer, you can reach to more people. I agree with you, we can't reach everyone. But what this is going to do is, it's going to make technology your friend, so that instead of just reaching to, let's say, 1 million people, you're going to reach to 10 million people now. There might be something else after that that will help you to reach 100 million people. But the key is also going to be storytelling. If you think you know what needs to be said, I think it'll be difficult. We really need to build the skill set so that we understand what. And that's where the reason I brought the movie industry and all is, they know exactly that. And this country is so rich in that. How do you really capitalize? You have technology, and our IT sector can develop anything you want. You have the creative, especially the cinema field. You got to be creative. You take a small collection, get these people to come, tell the story, and it'll be a blockbuster. It's like, the Netflix kind of thing. I'm not saying, you got to look at the Netflix to be a competitor, right? So, I'll just leave it like that. When I used to work at the Australian Museum, the creativity came where, there's a lot of bird watchers. So there's a natural history component there. So they would have a whole bunch of birds. These people would come to identify whether the bird they saw in the backyard, it was called birds in the backyard, right? If they can't, they'll put an image out there, and somebody else would then talk about it. So that way, you have that, and that it might be 50,000, 100,000 people, but that's a very active community. The more number of communities you create, then it is alive. It's not one way again, it's a two-way communication. So, that's what I mean is to be creative, but not one at the thing. It's like you're just building these numbers up.
I mean, I thought I would just add to something of my own to your question. Is that, in normal times, we have huge crowds of the kind that you described. People coming in from the districts, people going to the zoo, and they actually, in the winter peak season, they actually make up the bulk of our audience, and much of our gate money comes from those. And Victoria Memorial, I mean, most of you know this, is by a long, long margin India's most visited museum. In the last normal year, which was 2019-20, we had 4 million people coming in, more than 38 lakh paying, and more than 1 lakh coming in for free. I mean, whether they were school students or VVIPs and so on and so forth. But the way many of these people actually visit the museum does not make for useful public engagement with art. There is crowding, there is very little time. You cannot really engage with the objects which are there. So, what we did during this downtime, during lockdown, is that we sort of redefined our digital engagement. And many of you, most of you probably know that we tied up with partner institutions like the Delhi Art Gallery and the Jadunath Bhavan Museum and Resource Center, and also Kala Bhavan Shanti Niketan, to do a series of online exhibitions on artists from Bengal especially. Avanindranath, Gaganendranath, Sunayani Devi, Chitto Prasad, Nandalal Bose, and so on and so forth, where we actually explored the idea of very, very intimate and detailed engagement with public art. And they were all done through webinars, but they were all streamed live on Facebook Live. And many of those people, maybe, I would like to avoid these words, like Ganga Sagar is a very generic term. It's a kind of a label. It's like Brigade Parade Ground. So, but many people who would have otherwise had not the opportunity to focus on our objects on site because of crowding, because of lack of time, had the opportunity to make a very intimate public engagement with art through those online programs. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's not one or the other. The way we have tried to redefine our digital engagement to build up a body of public knowledge of art will then, we hope, will then reap dividends in terms of renewed footfall in the museum. So that's one of my responses to you. The other thing, it's just a thought, Vinod, and I would like to have Vinod's perspective on this, is that yes, I mean, digital engagement is part of the new normal. We have to do this because we have lost physical crowds to a great extent. Although all of us have reopened now, we have less footfall. So digital engagement is an interesting way, and to monetize it, obviously one of the major roadmaps ahead, which is why we are now engaging with these concepts like payment gateways and online ordering and courier service and all that. But one of the questions which intrigues me is that, when the educational institutions, universities, they have online classes, and that has raised the question of digital divide, because the new fault lines of our divided world are now defined by bandwidth and connectivity. And I remember that something like a Bible for the museum professional in recent times, Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 1000 Objects, originated from a radio talk show, right? A series of radio talks. So one of my questions is that in this new normal, in this way for digitization, just as we need to redefine and embrace the local, is there also a way to embrace the low-tech, for people who sort of community radio and so on and so forth, so that you monetize, you sell your merchandise, all of that happens, and you engage with QR codes and webinars and Zoom and all that stuff. But you also do build up a new public engagement for people who are not so smart, like the smartphone sense smart, but you give them something that they can enjoy and embrace through low-tech technologies like the radio and so on and so forth. So I would be interested in having your thoughts on the possibilities. This is something that sort of could mitigate all this debate about digital divide and all that. Digital is inevitable, but how we can also democratize the digital. So that's one of the questions that
I think it's a very complicated question. See, the main thing is, what is outreach and what is revenue raising? So we got to put a small difference. So I totally take the point on outreach. You know, the mandate for a museum is it should be open to everybody, and your services should go everywhere, right? And that's part of what you do is, of course, you know, you can have radio broadcasts. You might even have a small museum called Museum in a Box that can go to rural schools, so that, you know, do that. Now all that costs money. So within your budget, you just need to put that in. And I think it goes without saying, the more innovative you can go in that approach, the more you can raise funding from third-party sources, the more you can do that. But I think what this pandemic probably would do is, it's made technology, or rather people feeling comfortable with technology, a bit easier. I mean, I've never seen this many people use Zoom or use any of those mediums, but they feel it's only going to say, look, here is one section that is using it, let's capitalize on that. This again would be a group that can pay some money and you can raise some money. So while I think the basic principle needs to be where you got to provide access to everyone, that's your mandate, that's your vision, and that's the right thing for a museum to do. While this one would just be, this particular community could be, you know, 10 million, 100 million people. It's an audience that was not there before, especially I think that 15 to 35 age group audience, which will not come mostly to a museum. You have an opportunity to grab them because they're comfortable with technology. They're not going to come into a museum because it's too boring. So how do you make it interesting enough so that they can use and they can contribute, you know, to that? So that would be my thought.
Yeah, I'm Priyadarshi. So, you know, thank you for your illuminating illustrated lecture. You know, you have talked through up certain possibilities. Like the day before, the Oxfam report said that 84% of our people got badly hit during the economic crisis, but the billionaires, the amount available to billionaires increased by 35%. So regarding resources, you know, there is enough, there are many billionaires who have enough money, and only if the museum authorities can tap them, I feel this resource crunch can be suitably abridged. Even today in India, you know, two of the finest museums I saw were built by Maharaja Sayajirao in Baroda and the Nizam's museum in Hyderabad. And both of the museums were magnificent museums. So, you know, people are, I believe, only they need to be tapped. And regarding you said that, you know, lesser number of visitors, which also Professor Sengupta touched upon, lesser number of visitors. Now, this is again a temporary phenomenon. As the vaccination drive goes on, as more and more the vaccination drive goes on, more and more people are waiting to come to the museum. They're simply waiting. And, you know, that time will come, well, you know, the number of visitors will be more than before the pandemic, than it was there before the pandemic. Because people have a nostalgia for the past. Even the most illiterate person wants to know what happened, you know, thousands of years ago, or about his ancestors, and, you know, all that sort of stuff which museums deal about. So I think, you know, these are the 2 points which I feel, I'd like to have your comments on these 2 points.
On your first point, I do agree there is money, and the good thing I see in India is, I think more people are now putting the money and developing museums. You look at Shiv Nadar and, the Kiran Nadar, what they're doing. You look at Abhishek Podar, he's raised 250 crores for that new museum in Bangalore. You look at the science gallery that is opening up in Bangalore, so that's good. I think it's good for the museum movement in India, and you'll get, more and more of that happening. And you got to let the moment, if they want to contribute to a large museum, good. But if not, they might create something, but that's all very good. See, a country like India, my estimate is it can probably have 10, maybe, see right now India's, they say it's got about 1,000 museums. It can have 10 times as much. China was on a campaign to do about 200 to 400 museums a year. They did that for the last, 8 years. So just in the process of 8 years, they've done maybe 2,000 more new museums, because they knew that they had to make sure they compare to what's happening in Europe and things like that. So there is, opportunity for all, right? So that was your first question. The second one was? Yeah, I agree. That's what I said. In a few years, people will forget about it, but use the opportunity to grow what you have, right? Not at the cost. I mean,
contract people losing their jobs, they can all come back again just in a year or so. What your take on this?
They would. It takes a while to recover. Losing, say for example, you take a major museum losing $100 million a year for 3 or 4 years. The recovery time is a long time, right? So it will recover, I agree, right? But let's see how to capitalize and make it quicker. I really think monetizing online, if you can get it right, museums have the contents, right? They have the history, they have so much. And I think, it'll be a gold mine if you can get that right.
Mr. Daniel, how do you think will be the ratio of the gate money and the other sources of revenue for museums, given the coming 3-4 years when recovery will happen probably, but still it will not be at the pre-pandemic levels?
See, I think as a rule, depending on the museum, the country, the gate money is quite small. Many places they'll make museum entry free or subsidized so that anyone can come. It could be 5 rupees or whatever it is. Organized, museums like the Met might have a large, say $10-20 or whatever it is. But often they capitalize on the other things like using the museum as a venue, the cafes, the shops, and large corporate sponsorship for exhibitions and programs and all that kind of stuff. A typical museum might earn 60% through a combination of all that and 40% through a grant from the government. Often the grant from the government could be for basic necessities, and this, it's a very broad formula I'm just mentioning. So back to your question, yes, the gate takings is important, but it's not the only thing. But unless a person comes through the gate, they won't eat in the cafeteria, they will not buy a book. You have venues, you can't have programs with too many people, so people will not book the place for a venue. So the flow-on effect would be quite high.
How do you think the government grant, will be affected, particularly in a country like India with this kind of a unprecedented economic recession? By how much percent would it drop? And and what will particularly happen? Already, pre-pandemic, we've had a few museums. I don't know if you know, Mr. Daniel, about the Guru Sadai Museum. The Guru Sadai Museum, which was the folk museum that we had. So they were struggling pre-pandemic. So what happens? What will be the fallout?
See, again, this is very generic. The substantial expense in museums is for staff costs. There are institutions where 70% of the money goes for staff costs. And very often the governments would at least make sure they have enough money to pay for staff costs, because they're all public servants to a good extent. Then what you get on top might be very little, at least for a few years. And I think that's where the pressure is going to be. You can keep your staff, but when you can't do anything, it's very hard. You can do basic housekeeping and all that. If you want to do events, you want to do a whole range of things, that's where you need money, right? And I think that's where the pressure is going to be. They'll say, look, all these are, discretionary things. If it's all your staff costs would be met, and you might get a small little operating budget money, but you can't even blame governments, because again, look, they're all hit by 10% or whatever. So, it's a hard one. It's not just here, anywhere in the world it's going to be the same.
Yeah, thank you, Vinod. Excellent as usual. You mentioned about two things. One is telling the story, which obviously is the way out for online activities. You can monetize online activities now with, as you said, Netflix, Amazon Prime, all these. If you tell a good story, here, if you give an example of the Victoria Memorials collection, you can talk about the Zoffanies, you can talk about the Daniels, the story of how the Daniels traveled. You can give a tour of the country through the Daniels paintings. So, yes, that I think is a very, very correct way of monetizing. My point is, you said we have only 1,000 museums, we could have 10,000. But the problem is, where the museum professionals? Even the 1,000 museums we have are so pathetic. Due apologies, I'm not talking about all of them. But quite a few of them are really an apology. Where are the museum professionals who can make museums an interesting place? Don't you think that should be tackled along with, in the post-COVID situation, don't you think that is important?
May I add something to... yeah, I'll just take this opportunity to add something to GM's question, which is one of the most pertinent questions in the museum sector for now, and I have also told this here and there in my experience, is that one of the basic facts of the museum scenario, especially in the government now, we are talking about layoffs, we are talking about furloughs and other things during the pandemic times. But in any case, even in normal times, the government museums and probably other private museums also have a staff shortage. In Victoria Memorial, and I know this is true for the Indian Museum, this is true for the National Museum, everywhere. 50% of our sanctioned posts are vacant, which means that we are in dire need for new staff. And without naming names, I know that all across India there are these museology departments who are churning out museology graduates, postgraduates, PhDs every year. And normally there should be a natural synergy between these products of the museology education system and the demand that we generate. But there is none, because in most of the cases I have found that the museology syllabi in universities is sadly out of sync of what we need. It is not revised, they don't have a placement cell, there is no coordination between the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Higher Education, Human Resource Development. So I don't know how this mismatch will be sorted out, because that natural synergy is not there. Most of the things that we need are not skills that are generated by the museum curricula. And therefore this severe crisis of human resource will continue till we have been hearing about new national institutions for cultural heritage and heritage management and so on and so forth, but they are just not there. So it's a huge problem that you need, you can buy all the gadgets and the instruments that you can afford to with money. But museums or any institutions are made not by gadgets, not by instruments, but by people. And there are simply not enough people around. So this is something that we need to squarely focus on.
I mean, I agree with everything Jayanta said. Now, I think one of the good things that is going to happen is with this many new private museums. When I say private museums, these are museums that probably generate money from a whole range of sources. Government might put in some subsidy, but won't be the main driver. I think that also means there's going to be more demand for certain skills, which might mean more universities would start producing graduates. So it's a chicken and egg. I mean, you'll get a cycle. See, right now, one of the problems, I think maybe Jayanta would know this more than me, I keep hearing is, even recruitment, you can't change public service guidelines so that, say, you want to recruit somebody in conservation, they don't need a degree in conservation, they need a degree in science, right? To change that, it takes a long time and a lot of effort. So I think there's a whole range of issues there. And there's also a lot of people, I think, who want to get in but can't get in. So I think, maybe without, probably going in circles, I think the private sector or the non-government sector mushrooming, right from MAP to Science Gallery to Partition Museum to, all of that is great, because I think automatically more people would come, and I think that'll change. The other thing this pandemic specifically is going to help, I think, is you don't need to be physically here for certain skill sets. Say you want to design a exhibition on certain skills. Let's get somebody online who's based in some remote part, right? And we have the guts now to do it, because before we used to think, oh, look, I don't know how to use Zoom, I don't know how to, all that. So right now, I think we would feel more comfortable. So you'll pick skill sets. I think there's a lot of skills that are wasted because people have the skill sets, they are unable to travel, they are unable to come physically to a location because of whatever reasons, right? So I think that might help.
Hello, my question is somewhat related to the previous one. I was just asking that women as workforce working in different museums in the museum field, are they, do you think they are more hard hit by this pandemic situation? If so, do you have any statistics for that? And if so, why?
So this sector does have more women than men typically, if you look at it globally. So I would imagine more women would be hit because, this sector, like a few other sectors, say for example, if I take museology, conservation, you go even in the West, it's 90% women. So I would imagine, the impact would be much higher, for that one, but it's just because of that particular ratio. Very similar, you take the construction industry, you might have more men, but they also probably got hit badly, but now they're slowly coming back. So
I don't know whether, how far that is true or not, but I can't resist saying something which I've been saying, that in my experience, yes, there are many women in this, and they are, and I'm not saying this jokingly or to earn some brownie points, but they are in general better. They are just better professionals, at least in the museum scenario that I have seen.
Do you feel that we're talking about the importance of digitization and the need of digitization due to COVID? Do you feel that the introduction of virtual reality in the museum tours is important, because we're talking about monetization? So more immersive experience, like people would pay more, right? And one more thing is that, do you feel that digitization itself is very important without even COVID? Because there have been scenarios where I couldn't spend 4 or 5 hours in a museum. I would prefer that digitized, because by that I could actually see everything by nook and details. So I would really like to have comments on that.
So when you use the word digitization, often it is to make sure you get an electronic copy of that particular object, right? That's what you mean. Now, that's good for many reasons, right from security to condition reporting to a whole range of things. So even if you're not monetizing it, you're still, that's a basic need that needs to be met, because without that. So tomorrow if an object is kind of stolen and gone, if you have a digital copy, at least you can put it up so that nobody would buy it. So I think it's quite important. The next point on monetization is how do you tell the story? So digitization and monetization, I wouldn't relate them. Digitization is a basic need. It needs to be done so that you can meet the basic needs. The rest is the storytelling. That's where all the experience comes. The technology changes. It's very much up to the creative person to bring that story out and tell that. How they do that, it's quite important. It could be as simple as getting 10, 16-year-olds to come and do a story on a gallery which might become a blockbuster. You never know, right? So, and that's where the creativity comes in. How do you do it, right? So that's a whole different aspect.
Good evening, everyone. I am a school teacher at Birla High School, Shoreup Sen. And mine is not exactly an inquiry, it's just an appreciation. I heartily greet the organizers, especially the education unit of Victoria Memorial, for giving us this offline opportunity of a quiet get-together, and all my regards. And I wish to suggest that big agencies like ITC or ITC Shonar Hotels, Taj Bengals, they could sponsor some calendars or put them on sale, and the publicizing the love for museums. And even ITC can set out lovely exercise books promoting advertisements for creating more awareness among young learners for the love for museums, because museums motivate the onlookers. Museums are a marvelous mindscape, and they make us think, and they would make the young generation think and be more sensitive aesthetically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinod, for sharing your well-researched thoughts. So now we are open to public. And as you mentioned, the fund is the major issues everywhere in Indian Museum, in Victoria Memorial Hall, everywhere. So can you give us some suggestion whether we collaborate more with various organizations, embassies, to meet up the things, to organize many more programs? Because it will be difficult for like Indian Museum to organize, all alone. But if you collaborate, we can organize many more programs.
So, I mean, in a nutshell, you're asking what's the best way to fundraise, right? Is that look, first is you got to kind of maybe look at what might be of interest to the body that is supporting. I mean, this is more a fundraising, angle I'm taking, because only then the fit comes. Often, to have that conversation, I think it's quite important, so that you then do. Some might be more interested in the virtual part. Some might be interested in setting up a museum in a box that can travel. It could be any of those things. The other hindrance also, like what I mentioned before, is will they be willing to give money? I know some might, but would all be if they know that it's going to go into this particular structure, where if the director changes. I have to go and renegotiate everything. So that's why I think it's quite important. It's great, I mean, in Victoria Memorial that you have, you know there's a person there who does, I mean, I'm being very upfront to say, look, at the Chennai Museum, same problem. I know a lot of the people say, look, I don't want to support it because when this person goes, the next person comes, they would not follow up at all on what the discussions were. So that's where leadership, it's quite important. That's what a donor would look for. I think a mix of both is great. A good example of someone who's done that very well is CSMVS. So CSMVS, over the last 40 years, they would have raised, hundreds of crores because the money is there. They know the fit. They know exactly, this one I'll go and talk to somebody. They also know that by doing this, the implementation happens. So it just needs to be a mix of all that. It'll be good to put this across more to government, and it's a good time for museums to get a degree of independence. I can say this from outside, and so that they can actually be more creative. It needs to be a safe place for unsafe ideas. It needs to be where a neutral platform for doing things. That's how museums are supposed to be, and you'll automatically see, more support coming in.
So, good evening. Can you elaborate a little bit about the community engagement? You have shown community engagement with the museums.
Community engagement.
Suppose I come to a museum and I look at who are they catering to. So around the museum there's a whole community, right? Now that particular community, what do they think of the museum? So I know in the Pacific, they come, they use the museum for a whole range of events. Tomorrow if anything happens to the museum, they'll be on the street protesting, right? Here, would they protest if they close the museum? I know if onion prices go up, there'll be a protest, right? If auto rickshaw prices go up, there'll be a protest, isn't it? So that's what we mean by connecting. I also know that the community engagement helps in getting more revenues and a whole range of other things, but I think in a very simple level, how do you connect to the local community, which a lot of museums I know which are very successful do it very, very well. When they do it, then the city also knows this museum is very important for the community. Does it make sense?
Yeah, they changed the name of Victoria Memorial to huge protest. So there's good engagement with the community.
But as you can see, there is no protest at all because they haven't changed the name of the Victoria Memorial.
Thank you. My question is not directly related to museum per se, but to a similar cultural field, which is like smaller resource centers and archives, and which may be government funded, not government funded also. Now, there are many such institutions which are already kind of struggling because A, they cater to a very specified kind of audience and readership, mostly scholars, and do not usually have a mass public engagement as such. And with the COVID situation, when most of these resource centers are being shut, while there are events which are being organized digitally or otherwise, the problem from practical experience that I've heard is people do not really agree to the idea of paying for a virtual event. Because on one hand, especially for archives in a lot of cases, people do say, like, on one hand, when it's about putting everything on a open access platform, why do we pay for this virtual kind of a content? So how do you suggest about these smaller or other kind of institutions also? Thank you.
Like I mentioned before, I think digitizing, getting things in an electronic platform is a basic must. Because a physical thing might disappear at some stage, can get stolen, can get torn, you need condition reporting, a whole range of other things. So I don't think, and you got to find money to do it. I know that the volumes are so high, you can't get everything done, but it's a constant effort, to do that. So that's one. The second one is, I think what people pay for, it's an open competitive world. You got to be, that's where the creative sector needs to come in, right? You do pay for certain things online, you don't pay for certain things online, you know that, right? And you know, like you get on the web, you might want to watch this. I mean, why do you pay for it? Because you can find a connect. And that's where it comes in. I don't think there's a very standard formula that one can use. Say, for example, the example I gave you before, birds in the backyard. After some time, they can say, look, you want to be part of this community, pay $5 a month or whatever. These people love birds, right? So they're happy to pay that. So 50,000 people paying $5 is $250,000, right? So that's how you create that. I'll give you another site. There was a site where the museums had a lot of database on insects that were in particular areas. Now they would map it. It's called Biomaps, where somebody who's doing development might then go and see which would be the endangered species which would be in this part. So for them to get environmental clearance and stuff like that, they might use it. So you got to be creative, how you put the contents together.
I mean, perhaps I can add just a couple of things to what you asked, Ritika, and maybe I will say something with regard to an institution like the Jadunath Bhavan Museum and Resource Center, with which I am associated, with which you are also associated, and so on. So, you see, Jadunath Bhavan Museum and Resource Center is an institution. I know because of my personal history that it's a unit of the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, and its pool of human resource intellectuals is unparalleled. And it has an excellent collection of archival documents and also artwork like Nandalal Bose's postcards and all that stuff. Now the first thing I think, before the question of monetization etc. comes up, the first thing is to make an effort to build up a brand. Right? JMBRC also has, it has beautifully designed by you know whom these calendars and postcards and all that stuff. But I think, for instance, and I have mentioned this before, that there should be a very active social media site where that is all publicized. You have to make known what is happened. With the collaboration that we did with JMBRC and DAG, now people know that there is this beautiful artwork. Or the exhibition with Calcutta that was done, it should be up. To just give you an example, after we started the Jatan project and after our artwork, most of it went up on the Museums of India website, we now have almost every day a few requests for image permissions for scholarly publications. We have, I will use the word sell, we have sold around 120 Bharat Matas by Abanindranath Tagore in the last 4 or 5 years because people came to know and people could see the image. So that's for a start, that it should be publicized very proactively that we have this. If you want this, you can buy this from us, you can help this from us. So that's where obviously there are all these projects where one should apply whether or not money comes, but there are, and now I also know that you have an auditorium where you can have small functions, so this is all part of that archive. And one needs to tell people that there is this, and you have to identify the kind of crowd, the kind of audience who would want to wish to use that particular auditorium for their own functions. So it's a mix and match of various approaches, but the first order of business is to make known very proactively through whatever platforms available is what you have and what you have to offer. Right? Yes, please, Raju. And I think that's the last question we will take.
You see, I just wanted to briefly revisit a point that Shayan had raised. He used a very apt term of collaboration. I think it is eminently possible to do collaboration programs, and probably as a model where in the collaboration, without having to have actual money flowing from one organization to the other, if the financial responsibilities can be divided, so that you take part of the financial and organizational responsibilities and the other partner takes up the other part. I just want to give you an example of the kind of excellent concerts that we have had in this quadrangle with the French and the Italians, right? So there was no kind of money exchanging, but it was very clear that the partners bring in the group till they arrive here. And from the moment they touch here, Victoria Memorial Hall takes care of the rest of it, So that could be a model for collaboration where you don't actually go begging for funds, but as equal partners, share the financial responsibilities in a way that it is feasible for both organizations to partner and come out with some brilliant stuff. So this is just what I wanted to elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Raju. And that was the last question for this evening. Thank you so much, Vinod, for these fascinating insights and laying down a roadmap ahead, which has to be shaped by all of our contributions and thinking through all of these challenges, and for responding to all of these questions beautifully. And thank you so much for this question. So, by the end of this evening's event, we have had a very useful conversations. These conversations will continue to resonate with us as we think through the challenges of this new normal, but we will cut our way through it with difficulties, with new thoughts, with challenges. But thanks to people like Vinod, thanks to people like you, and thanks to all of these conversations, because these conversations must go on, we will find our way. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here and taking part in this conversation. We will have another event coming up, and I will request Raju Raman to tell you about that.
I'll use this. Thank you very much. Actually, we may have masks which cover our mouths, but that doesn't prevent us from using our hands to applaud the speaker for this evening, Mr. Vinod Daniel. Thank you very much for your wonderful insights and for providing us a lot of food for thought this evening. I'm sure that we can take many of these ideas forward. There was something which I should have mentioned right at the beginning, and I apologize that I did not. With the month of January, actually, we had kicked in the centenary year of the Victoria Memorial Hall. So this happens to be the centenary year because the first visitors who came into this then memorial, which was still probably not conceived as a museum at that time, was on the 28th of December 1921. So 2021 happens to be the centenary year. We naturally have a lot of events lined up for this centenary year. Today was a kind of trial run, as it were, a test to see, and encouraged by the kind of response that we have got, we are sure that we'll go ahead with all the plans that we had on paper and in our minds for the rest of the year. So do join us for all the other events. There is one day after tomorrow in this quadrangle, but that is again for limited audience. It will also be streamed live. It is a collaboration with the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, where there is going to be a discussion on Jibanananda Das and also a musical recital by Kaushiki Chakraborty. So that is the next event. But another thing I would like to let you know is that the museum galleries, which were temporarily closed down for all the renovation and for setting up the multimedia exhibition to honor Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose on his 125th birth anniversary, will be thrown open to the public tomorrow, from tomorrow. So from tomorrow, which is the 28th of January, 11 a.m., the museum galleries will reopen, including the special exhibition that has been put up. And during this period, as it was during the pandemic period, and since we opened, the timings will be 11 a.m. to to 5 p.m. You could spread the word around, and if you have not had the opportunity to see part of the tour of that exhibition on television when the Prime Minister was visiting it, please do come in and take a look yourselves. Thank you very much, and have a safe journey home. The Light and Sound show will happen sooner than later. We ourselves do not know when, probably next month, and we will make an announcement about that too.